Hello, so right now we're going to be doing the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. Now this is quite a long-winded and complicated process, so you may have to go over this a couple of times before you follow it. And the difficulty is that it's very similar to the electron transport chain in respiration. It's very easy to get them confused and mixed up and to get confused as to why we're doing this, particularly in photosynthesis. Now, there are two parts to the light-dependent reactions. Those are called photolysis and photoionization. And I always start with photoionization. So, photoionization is what's happening here. Now, this is all happening inside a chloroplast on the grana. So if I zoom back up a slide, you can see here, all these circles here are the grana. And they're stacked on top of each other, and they're made of this thing called thylakoid. And the membrane that makes them is called the thylakoid membrane, and inside of there you've got the thylakoid lumen. So I've got grana, which are these stacks of things. They're made of a substance called thylakoid. The membrane of them is called the thylakoid membrane, and the inside is called the lumen. So if I have a look here, I've got the thylakoid lumen. I'm effectively looking at that yellow bit there. This membrane, where the chlorophyll and these proteins are found, is this kind of blue membrane here. And then the chloroplast stroma, well, this is this pink bit here. So, let's have a look. We've got chlorophyll, electron carrier proteins. These are just proteins that are going to take electrons and carry them along. We've got hydrogen ions hanging around. And we've got this molecule here I hope you recognise from respiration, but you might not, called ATP synthase. Now, ATP synthase, the whole point of that is to make ATP. So, first thing that happens in photoionization is a chlorophyll absorbs a photon of light. Now, how many photons of light is irrelevant. It could be a billion photons of light or one photon of light. At A level, we don't care. When that happens, though, 2 electrons get excited. Again, 2 electrons, 6 electrons, 10 electrons, doesn't matter. Some electrons. If you can't remember the number, doesn't matter, it's not on the A level. But it does happen to be 2 electrons for 1 photon of light. So far, light hits chlorophyll. And remember, chlorophyll, if you don't remember from your GCSE, is kind of a green pigment. It's just a chemical that can absorb energy, in this case light energy, and it's going to release these 2 electrons. Now those electrons don't hang around. Electrons don't just hang around, they always attach themselves onto something. In this case, they're going to attach themselves onto these electron carrier proteins. So I hope that I will be demonstrating that in this PowerPoint. Yes, there we go. And they're going to be passed along. Now every time they're passed along, they lose a little energy. Now in chemistry that's called going down an energy level. I believe it has something to do with orbitals. In biology we don't care. We've got the idea that these things are losing some energy, and that energy is going to be used for something. In this case, I'm going to come to it in a second, but this energy is going to be used to pump these hydrogen ions across this membrane. So far, chlorophyll absorbs a photon of light, it excites 2 electrons, and those then pass along these proteins called electron carrier proteins. Now, there's going to be some questions there, 3 questions, and I'd like you just to pause me, and to make sure you've got what I've been saying, that you're not being left behind at any point, have a go at those 3 questions, and I'll go through the answers when you unpause me. So, when light energy is absorbed by chlorophyll, it excites 2 electrons, or more accurately, I should stop saying that, it excites electrons. Where do electrons go when they're excited? They get attached onto the electron carrier proteins. And what happens to them when they're passed along? They lose some energy. So far, I hope, so easy. If you didn't get that, go back and listen again, or ask me in a lesson or at lunchtime or break time if you still don't understand. So far, we have got the electrons moving down. Now when that happens, it allows a hydrogen ion to be pumped across from the stroma, which remember is the outside bit, is the kind of the background, the cytoplasm of the chloroplast, into the thylakoid lumen. So into those grana, into that circular thing, into the middle of it. Every time that these electrons move along, hydrogen ions get passed across. Now, that is extremely important. In fact, it's the whole point of this whole electron thing. It's the whole point of photoionization, is to allow this to happen. So, another couple of questions, just to make sure again you're understanding me there. Have a look at those 2. The number 5 is something for you to work out. Hopefully not too difficult there. So again, pause me. Incidentally, I should have made clear earlier, you can write down the questions and the answers, or the answers. You have to make a decision as to what's more useful for you. So if you just want to write down the answers, just write down the answers. But if you want to write down both, write down both. But pause me. So, the energy for hydrogen ion to be transported across the thylakoid membrane comes from the electrons being passed across the electron transfer protein. So, every time the electron moves down through a protein, it loses a bit of energy. Now that makes sure there's a high hydrogen ion concentration in the thylakoid lumen compared to the chloroplast stroma. Now, we come to ATP synthase. Now, you will have studied this in respiration, and this may be teaching you to suck eggs, but particularly if you're away for those lessons, ATP synthase is an absolutely essential protein. In fact, it's an enzyme, but as well as being an enzyme, it's also a channel protein. Now, a channel protein is a protein that allows molecules to move through a membrane by going through this little channel here between the two pink blobs. In this case, hydrogen ions. Now, every time the hydrogen ion goes through, it's going to physically turn this little turnstile bit at the top. When that happens, it's going to slam ADP into inorganic phosphate and create ATP. So the whole point is to make ATP. And ATP, as I hope you remember from year 12, is the molecule that we use to transfer energy around within a cell. So we take the ATP away out of something else. In respiration, it's out of glucose. In photosynthesis, we take the energy out of the light. Either way, we're going to be using ATP synthase to transfer that into ATP, which can then transfer that energy around the cell. So it looks like that in real life. So you can see this is what it actually does. It physically spins. And these little blobs flying in and out are ADP and inorganic phosphate flying in, ATP flying out. Okay, so what's going to happen here? The hydrogen ions, well, there's a massive concentration gradient here. There's almost no hydrogen ions here, and there's loads here. So they're going to want to balance that out. And by want to, of course I don't mean want to, I mean they're going to balance it out just because of the laws of chemistry. They're naturally going to spread out from high concentration to low concentration. And this is called facilitated diffusion. Diffusion, but using a little protein. So, what's going to happen? Hydrogen ion goes through. Another hydrogen ion goes through. And I have to say I'm very proud of that animation. It only took me about half an hour to achieve that. You're going to make ATP. That's the whole point. Now, here's the first mistake people make. This ATP is not going to go and be used for active transport, to make muscles move, or for anything ATP is usually used for. That's what respiration is for. Respiration is to make ATP for all that stuff. This ATP only exists to go and do what we're going to call the light-independent reactions, the second bit of photosynthesis. So it's going to go out of here, it's going to immediately be used in the light-independent reactions. So photosynthesis does not make any ATP overall. It doesn't release any ATP, because this ATP is going to be immediately used up in the second bit of photosynthesis. So we're going to make it very, very briefly, and then it's going to be used up. So overall, photosynthesis doesn't make ATP. We just make it, and then we lose it again. Alright, so that's the first thing that people think is, oh, well, that ATP, I could use that for active transport. You don't. That's what respiration is for. And remember, plants do respiration too. That's where they get their ATP for active transport, etc., etc., etc. Now, that was all photoionization. But there's a final issue here. And there's some notes there. If you've been pausing me and taking notes, you're welcome to. That's there. Pause me. But there's a final issue here. The electrons are just sat here, and eventually this triangular electron carrier protein, of course it's not really triangular, will be covered with electrons and won't be able to accept any more electrons. So these electrons need to go somewhere. Now in respiration, which has a very similar process called the electron transport chain, these will be attached onto oxygen, and then hydrogen would bind with that to make water. That's not what happens here. Here, the electrons get attached onto hydrogen ions, and they make hydrogen atoms. That gets rid of the electrons here, but does use up 2 of our hydrogen ions we had from earlier. Now they don't just sit there, those hydrogen atoms. You might think, well, maybe those hydrogen atoms make a hydrogen molecule that's released into the air. No, that's not what happens. They get attached onto a hydrogen carrier molecule called NADP. Now this is a bit like NAD in respiration, in that when you attach two hydrogens to it, it's going to become reduced NADP. Now, just like the ATP, the reduced NADP is going to be used in the light-independent reactions. So we'll come to that later. Both this and this are going to go to the light-independent reactions. They're going to be really useful for making glucose. So neither of them is a final product. They're both going to be used up later on in photosynthesis. Now, there's some questions there. 6, 7, 8, and 9. Get myself out of the way. There we go. So pause me. So the protein channel that's used to create ATP is called ATP synthase. Hydrogen ions pass through this to produce ATP. Electrons that are still on the electron transport chain get attached to hydrogen ions to make hydrogen atoms. And NADP is the carrier molecule that carries away the hydrogen atoms. Okay. So the issue with the whole scenario is this, and I'm not going to get you to work out this thing. You could have a look at this, you can pause this and have a look. The issue is that you've lost 2 electrons from chlorophyll, and you've lost 2 hydrogen ions. Now, eventually you're going to run out of electrons, you're going to run out of hydrogen ions, and there's nowhere to get them from. You can't just get them from somewhere else. You can't just get them from somewhere else very easily. And so we have to get them using a chemical process called photolysis. So we've had photoionization and photolysis, L-Y-S-I-S. Now, photolysis is where water comes along, and another thing chlorophyll does when it gets light is it slices up water into hydrogen ions, oxygen, and electrons. So as well as the electrons being excited out of the chlorophyll and buzzing off and doing their electron carrier protein thing, light also causes water to be split up into these 3 bits. Now, the electrons, they go to the chlorophyll. The hydrogen ions, they be hydrogen ions, they just sit around because we've just lost 2 hydrogen ions earlier on. So they're replacing the hydrogen ions we just lost. And the oxygen, well, that's a waste product as far as the plant is concerned, and so oxygen is just released. And that's why photosynthesis is, carbon dioxide plus water turns to glucose and oxygen. Now, we've used up water here, we've made oxygen, and we'll come up to the carbon dioxide and glucose when we do the light-independent reaction next week. So, that's the basics of photolysis. Now, you can go back and you can play that again. You can play it more slowly, you can pause it, you can do whatever you want to do. You need to keep going until you feel like you understand exactly what's happening. You understand exactly what photoionization is for, that it's for making reduced NADP and ATP, and you know what photolysis is for, that it's for replacing the hydrogen ions and the electrons which we lost in photoionization. So, if you get that, you'll be able to do this question, which is a little bit difficult, I'll be honest, because the way they've laid it out is they're giving you a really weird looking diagram. But if you actually look at it carefully, you can see that hopefully it's more clear to you how to put this. Have a good look at it, don't immediately give up to what I'm saying. You can see there's bits on there you'll recognise, like electron acceptors, like chlorophyll, like ATP, like NADP. So have a look and see if you can figure out the answers to these questions. I'll go through them. I have to say this is the most difficult question I could find on the light-dependent reaction, because I know we did it quite recently in class, so I do want to give you a challenge. Okay, so have a look at it and have a go. And pause me. Okay, so in which part of the chloroplast do the light-dependent reactions occur? Well, you could have the thylakoid, you could have the grana, you have the thylakoid membrane. That's where it's happening. Okay, the substances in boxes A, B, and C. Now, A is oxygen. So, if you have a look at this, what we've got is photolysis. So you can see you've got water, and it's being broken up into hydrogen ions and other bits. Now they've deliberately made this more difficult. You can see you've got hydrogen ions here, you can see you've got electrons here. The electrons are going to the chlorophyll, the hydrogen ions are going up here, and we'll talk about that in a second because that's C. Now all of this fluff about 4 OH minuses and 2 H2Os is stuff that's not on the A level, that's deliberately not on the A level to try to confuse you. But if you actually think about, well, I've got some water, it's made some electrons, it's made some hydrogen ions, what else does it make overall? Well, photolysis, if we go back, makes electrons, hydrogen ions, and oxygen. And so this is just them trying to stretch you, them trying to get you to think about photolysis and to go, right, I've had electrons, I've had hydrogen ions, which is H+, what else do I make? I make oxygen. Now that's the hardest bit of this question in my opinion. B, well, what do I need to make ATP? What was I slamming together to make ATP? I was slamming ADP and inorganic phosphates. And then C, well, what happens when I join NADP onto some hydrogen? I make reduced NADP. Right, use the information in the diagram to explain the role of chlorophyll in photolysis. So let me show you the mark scheme for this because it's worth 3 marks. So you can see, it absorbs light energy, it loses electrons, it accepts electrons from water. Now, in all honesty, there's a lot on here that is not on A level as well. So for instance, Paul's equilibrium to the right, that's chemistry. No one likes chemistry, that's the thing. OH minuses, that's not on the A level either. So forget it. If you had written down everything we talked about photolysis, you would have talked about light being involved, you would have talked about electrons replacing electrons lost in photoionization. Now you might also have talked about how it's getting broken down to hydrogen ions and oxygen as well. That won't lose you marks, but it will just be extra stuff you've written that won't get you marks. If we go back to C part 2, how energy of light is converted into chemical energy in light-dependent reactions. Now, it's surprisingly difficult to find an exam question which is just about light-independent reaction. That's because almost everything about the light-dependent reaction also links into the light-independent reaction. And so this is all I could find. Now there's a 1 mark here, this is 2 marks, unfortunately it's been cut off where I've cropped the page a while ago. So 3 marks total. Now that's not too bad, I would hope. So have a look at that and pause me and have a go at completing this. Okay. In photosynthesis, which chemicals are needed for the light-dependent reaction? Well, let's have a look. Do I need NADP, ATP and water? Let's start off with that. Well, I definitely need the water, that's true. Water is absolutely required for the light-dependent reaction because that's what photolysis uses. Do I require NADP? Absolutely. I need NADP because it's going to be accepting hydrogen atoms and being turned into reduced NADP. Do I need ATP? No. I'm going to be making ATP actually. Let's go up to the next most, perhaps easiest one to get rid of. This one. Reduced NADP. Do I need reduced NADP to start with? No, I don't, because reduced NADP is one of the things I make. Also, I don't need oxygen to start with. I'm going to be making oxygen as a product. So both oxygen and reduced NADP are products. Reduced NADP, ATP, water and carbon dioxide. Well, we've already talked about reduced NADP and ATP. And then finally, NADP, ADP, inorganic phosphate, which is incidentally, if you don't know what PI stands for, inorganic phosphate, should have come across that before, but if you haven't, that's what it stands for. And water, it's this one down here, yes. I need NADP to be reduced, I need ADP and inorganic phosphate to make ATP, and I need water for photolysis. Now describe what happens during photoionization in the light-independent reaction. Let me show you the mark scheme. 1. Chlorophyll absorbs light. 2. Electrons are lost or chlorophyll becomes positively charged. You could have electrons go to the electron transport carrier chain. Now you might also have written about how they're going to be passed along, about how hydrogen ions are being passed across. That's all perfectly good, but those are the two things they want you to focus on. Okay. Now, in terms of you've got to be thinking about the wording here. You may have written quite a lot of things, but you might not have written the electrons go to the electron transport carrier chain or are moved onto the electron transport carrier chain, in which case you won't get that second mark. Part of the A-level biology, unfortunately, is just doing loads of these questions until you get used to what they're asking you, what they're not asking you. Right. So, hopefully it's very clear. Now next week we're going to do the light-independent reactions, so we'll be able to do more on photosynthesis then. Okay, thank you very much.